Minister, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2018 MacCormick European Lecture. My name is Anne Glover and I'm the President of the RSE, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is Scotland's National Academy. We're an academy of sciences, arts and letters and have over 1,600 fellows elected from every area of Scottish life. And that would include academia, business, public life and the creative industries. Our mission at the RSE is to advance learning and useful knowledge. And this is done to support the cultural, the economic and social well-being of Scotland and its people. So as well as the many educational and outreach activities that we undertake, we are extremely active in generating trusted, impartial advice, and we also provide a safe space for debate. To mention a small example of what we are currently doing, and really to match the topic of this evening's lecture, we've prepared a series of advice papers recently examining the main challenges and opportunities arising from Brexit, and these advice papers can be seen on our website, and this work is still ongoing. We've launched a major energy inquiry called Scotland's Energy Future, and we hope to report on that by the end of this year. And as well as that, we are doing an update of our report on looking at women or gender in the workplace and encouraging women into STEM subjects, the original report being published in 2012. And we're doing a refresh of that to see have things improved, and if not, what still needs to be done. And again, we hope that report will be published in November next month. But we're here tonight for the MacCormick European Lecture. And this lecture is held in honour of Sir Neil MacCormick, who died in 2009. Sir Neil was a professor of jurisprudence at the University of Edinburgh. And he was active in politics, I think, almost all of his life. He was elected to the European Parliament in 1999 as a Scottish National Party member of the European Parliament. And he had a real passion for all things European and contributed greatly to the work of the RSE in European and international affairs. Amongst many honours that he received during his lifetime, he also was awarded the RSE Royal Gold Medal in 2004 to mark his outstanding achievements. We remember him by this annual lecture. We have had many outstanding public figures presenting this lecture in the past, including Lord Patten, former Governor of Hong Kong, Professor Mary McAleese, who was the former President of Ireland, and also Irina Bokova, who was the former Director General for UNESCO. And I've just picked a few as an example. So we are very honoured this evening to welcome Dr. Hoesung Lee, who is the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to deliver the 2018 MacCormick Lecture. So first, let me just say a few words about the IPCC. It was founded in 1988 as an intergovernmental body of the United Nations. And its role is to provide objective scientific views of climate change and its impact, both, well, environmentally, economically, and politically. I think it's rather an outstanding example of a global organisation which analyses evidence, and that allows governments to develop climate-related policy. evidence-based policy. So now to our speaker. Dr. Hoesung Lee was elected chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in October 2015. But he was not a stranger to the IPCC and had worked with the IPCC for many years, and indeed was the vice chair from 2008 to 2015. Dr. Lee is an economist from Korea. He got his BA from Seoul National University and his PhD in economics from Rutgers University in the US. He's an endowed chair professor at the Korea Graduate School, University Graduate School of Energy and Environment in Seoul. And his research encompasses the economics of climate change, energy, and sustainable development. He's a member of the board of directors of the Korean Academy for Environmental Sciences, a council member for the Global Green Growth Institute, and a member of the Asian Development Bank's President's Advisory Board on Climate Change and Sustainable Development. Dr. Lee was the founding president of the Korea Energy Economics Institute, a government agency for national energy policy development. He served as a president, a board member, and an advisor for a range of international organizations, and has served on many national and international committees addressing climate change and energy. So I would like you to please join with me to welcome Dr. Lee to present the 2018 MacCormick European Lecture entitled Addressing Climate Change and Pursuing Economic Development, Reflections from the IPCC. Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Professor Damon Glover, the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Professor Jim Ski, the IPCC Working Group 3 co-chair, distinguished colleagues, friends. Thank you for your invitation. I'm very much honored to have this opportunity to meet you and to talk about the IPCC activities. As an economist, I'm honored and moved to be speaking in this city, in this distinguished institution associated with Adam Smith, one of the founding fathers of my discipline, and also a towering figure of the Scottish Enlightenment. In The Wealth of Nations, he wrote, "Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition." His words of over 200 years ago could almost describe the mandate of the IPCC. The IPCC role, after all, is to provide governments and other decision makers with policy-relevant information about climate change, its impacts, future risks, and options for addressing it. In this way, governments can formulate policy and reach international agreements based on scientific evidence rather than prejudice, lobbying, or whatever other than scientific evidence. That's what Smith called enthusiasm and superstition. This policy relevance is the hallmark of the IPCC. It is also in your motto, quote, "Knowledge made useful," unquote, the principle of informing the work of Royal Society of Edinburgh. This evening, I would like to talk about our policy-relevant work, how IPCC assessments on climate science could enable policymakers to develop response options to climate change while contributing to pursue other societal goals such as sustainable development. I shall illustrate this with our latest special report, released just only a week ago, on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the fact of dangerous climate change and its human causes is no longer in question. In the 5 assessment reports over the last 30 years, by the way, this year is our 30th anniversary of IPCC, the IPCC has shown the multiple lines of evidence for a changing climate. Human influence on the climate change is clear. The IPCC continues its effort to improve climate knowledge at the regional level, including the understanding of extreme events and sea level rise, so that policymakers can draw on this knowledge to build more resilient communities. Now, encouraged by the Paris Agreement, scientific attention is engaging more closely with actionable response measures. The IPCC is placing a greater focus on solutions, and this means that we will see the social sciences playing a greater role in our work. Looking at climate change issues, problems, or solutions, or whatever you have, through the lens of economics, sociology, anthropology, or international relations, can be politically sensitive. But this is where science takes us. And these disciplines enable us to understand the human side of the transition to a low-carbon future. This will facilitate the policymakers to develop efficient, effective, and equitable measures to a low-carbon future. We, IPCC, through our last 5 assessments, have already found that in most countries, governments address climate change in the context of other national priorities, such as energy security, equitable development, and poverty alleviation, just to give a few examples. And that many actors are involved in this effort, including local governments and the private sectors. Therefore, to be successful and effective, climate action must be relevant to broad national priorities and societal concerns. The IPCC has spent 3 decades to demonstrate the human influence on the climate system. Our task now is to show how human activity can also produce low-carbon social development. We need science to provide insight into the nature of the link between climate action and other national priorities, such as the sustainable development, and characterize the interaction and feedbacks between these 2 aspects. We, the scientific community, will continue to calculate the risks associated with different emissions pathways, but we also need to understand how different stakeholders judge and respond to a risk. This goes beyond technology and scientific calculation to an understanding of social values, consumption, and behavioral choices, which we believe the fundamental drivers of action. Our special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius considers these enabling conditions that underpin mitigation and adaptation. We address this feasibility across 6 dimensions: geophysical, environmental and ecological, the technological, economic, and socio-cultural, and finally, institutional dimensions. This report shows that it is the human system that matters in limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They are the governance and institutional capacity, technological and financial capacity, and behavioral choices. So the report concludes that, the special report 1.5 concludes that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is not impossible, but would require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. Second, there are clear benefits to keeping warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees or higher, and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees can go hand in hand with achieving other world goals. If I were to summarize these highlights into just one phrase, it would be every bit of warming matters, and every bit of human actions matters more. Let's pause to recall the context of this report. When governments met 2015 to produce the Paris Agreement, they decided to invite IPCC to produce a special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. The IPCC decided to accept that invitation, but at the same time, we've decided to frame that special report in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. When parties at the Paris Convention considered the decision to arrive at the Paris Agreement, they had very good scientific understanding about the 2-degree world, largely thanks to the IPCC's fifth assessment report, then available to all the policymakers and to the scientific community. But compared to that knowledge regarding 2 degrees Celsius world, relatively very little was available about the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. 10 years ago, that was the first time when the public discourse on 1.5 degree was presented. That was in Copenhagen Conference of Parties meetings. There are more than 100 countries requested the consideration of 1.5 degree warming. And then in 2015, the parties decided to invite IPCC to do a special report on this. 2018, this year, that was the year that the parties to the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC asked us to complete the study, because the study would be needed as a scientific input to the Talanoa dialogue that will be conducted at the end of this year in the Katowice Climate Change Convention. It was extremely challenging for the IPCC to do this special report in a somewhat less than 2 years of a time. We decided to produce this report under the joint leadership of 3 working groups: climate science, impact science, and then mitigation analysis and science, working group 1, 2, 3. And that's thanks to the superb leadership of 3 working group co-chairs, including Professor Jim Skee present here, we were able to produce a magnificent special report on 1.5. This joint leadership of 3 working group expertise will be a feature of our remaining 2 other special reports that will be available next year in this assessment cycle. This special report on 1.5 is the outcome of the work of 91 dedicated lead authors and review editors from 40 countries, with inputs of 133 some contributing authors. The authors evaluated more than 6,000 literatures for this assessment. These successive drafts of the report received more than 42,000 comments from more than 1,000 experts, including academic community as well as the government sectors. There were 5 countries, 5 governments who hosted the meetings required to produce this special report: 1 scoping meeting and 4 lead author meetings. We are very much grateful to those 5 countries who have provided this very valuable support for the production of this special report. The culmination of this process was an approval session 2 weeks ago in Korea, with representatives of our member governments working with authors on the summary for policymakers to ensure it was a clear, faithful representation of the full report. The governments teased out the essentials of the report in a spirit of compromise drawing on the creativity of our lead authors. The result was a summary for policymakers and the underlying report approved and accepted by all our member governments. We believe that this report is a rich resource for governments formulating policy affected by climate change and a key input into the coming climate negotiations. I'd like to elaborate on the key messages that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, the world is already experiencing the impacts of rapid and unequivocal global warming. You can see this, for example, in coral reef decline, sea level rise, Arctic sea ice change, biodiversity loss, declining crop yields, more frequent heat waves, and heavy rainfall. The world has warmed 1 by 1 degree already. This warming is not evenly distributed. Some places are warming faster than the global average. By the last decades, from 2006 to 2015, about 20 to 40% of the global population had already experienced warming of 1.5 degrees in at least one season, although the global average was about close to 1 degree Celsius. And the impacts are to fall disproportionately on the poor and vulnerable, who are least responsible for causing this climate change. It is thanks to the IPCC's work that we know this. These impacts were much projected decades ago by our previous assessments. Also, we know that we can minimize these impacts by keeping warming as low as possible. Importantly, the past emissions that cause current warming are not in themselves enough to take us to 1.5 degrees. So we still have the option of acting to meet this 1.5 degree goal. Secondly, the extra bit of warming with worsen impacts, resulting, for instance, in more severe heat waves, rainfalls, insidious crop losses, and so on. We are not well adapted, very clearly, for the impacts that we are already seeing. We are already vulnerable to climate change. This indicates that there are clear benefits from limiting warming to 1.5 degrees that would be reflected in, for example, less heat stress, greater food security, and better air quality than at higher levels of warming. It's leading to better health, higher productivity, and better economy. Note that some of the most affected areas are small islands, megacities, coastal regions, and high mountain ranges. Thus, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees could result in 420 million fewer people being exposed to severe heat waves, one of the key findings of our 1.5 special report on 1.5. Looking at ecosystems, there is a chance that some tropical coral reefs would survive with 1.5 degree warming, but they would virtually disappear with 2 degree warming. The Arctic Sea is projected to be ice-free in summer, once per decade with warming of 2 degrees, but with 1.5 degrees, this would be perhaps once per century. Warming of 1.5 degrees will mean losing fewer plants and animal species and will help protect forest and wetland habitats. The stress on oceans will be less at 1.5 degrees than at 2 degrees, where oceans are getting more acidic, affecting sea life, and could take centuries to recover. Exceeding warming of 1.5 degrees also risks irreversible impacts and triggering instabilities in Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. Losing these ecosystems matters greatly and directly for the people and livelihoods that depend on them, and globally for sustainable development. Some places are experiencing multiple impacts at the same time, often the places that are the least able to cope. There are particularly high risks for the Mediterranean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the small island states. Thirdly, the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would require a strong reduction in carbon dioxide emissions reaching near zero by around 2050. This will require deep changes in all aspects of society, for example, energy, land use, buildings, transport, food and diets, and cities. This implies requirements of new technologies for energy efficiency storage and less carbon-intensive energy sources, less deforestation, managing land better, and sustainable agriculture. By 2050, scenarios consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees indicate that renewables would supply 1/2 to 2/3, 49% to 67% of primary energy. But even then, we would need to remove CO2 from the air to offset the remaining emissions, for instance, from transport and agriculture. We would also need to reduce the amount of energy consumed globally and use it more efficiently. All of this require timing, good timing. Time is of essence. The sooner the emissions fall, the more options we keep on the table. And doing more now reduces reliance on unproven and risky techniques to remove CO2 from the air. Doing opposite, we would shift the burden of responsibility to later generations, as well as causing more climate change now and later. The fourth and last, the report shows that tackling climate change can be consistent with ensuring people around the world are healthy and prosperous and have food, clean air, and water. Needless to say, everything is connected, and this special report quantitatively, scientifically proves that everything is connected. Tackling climate change is the same as ensuring the welfare of the world's population, which is what the economics of climate change is saying. Please allow me some observations on the economics of climate change. In public discourse, climate action is often presented as a trade-off with economic development. I'm sure you are quite familiar with that line of argument. But what will differentiate the sixth assessment report we are working on now from previous IPCC assessment is that it will present a scientifically clear link between climate action and economic development. We will pursue this by presenting an integrated picture of the climate and human systems, that is, emissions, climate risks, and development pathways. Central to this integrated evaluation is, I believe, a cost of mitigation. The cost of mitigation is calculated in models as the difference between a mitigation pathway or reduced or falling emissions and baseline emissions rising in line with economic growth. But the higher these projected baseline emissions, the bigger the gap with the mitigation pathway, and so the more expensive mitigation costs appear to be. However, if carbon-intensive energy consumption continues unabated, the impacts of climate change in the economy will reduce the economic growth, in turn resulting in lower energy demand and thus a lower baseline. In other words, business as usual may turn out to be very far from usual in a high-carbon world. Furthermore, when we set the cost of doing nothing against the new economic opportunities arising from climate action, the equation becomes quite different. We need to close the loop currently existing between the natural system and the human system. Allow me to close by mentioning another important transformation, and that is the role of women in science. In IPCC, in selecting its author teams, among other criteria, the IPCC seeks gender balance. We still have some way to go, but there is a clear and improving trend. Let me give you some statistics. In our just completed special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, women make up 32% of 91 authors and review editors. For the sixth assessment report, the proportion is 33%. This compares with 22% for the fifth assessment report completed in 2014. In pursuing this transformation, we are inspired by many role models. Indeed, you need look no further than the RSE to your president, Damon Glover, and her distinguished predecessor, Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell. Thank you for your invitation and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. We'll now take questions from, from the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please put your hand up, but wait for a member of RSE staff who will come and give you a microphone. For those of you who are in the upper gallery, you should come to the side door of the lecture theatre. That's being opened for you now. And we can take questions from there as well. Can I ask that when you get the microphone, that you hold it very close to your mouth, because otherwise we won't be able to hear you. Can you say who you are? And can you also please keep your question short? Questions. So question here, right-hand side of the room. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Severin Carell. I'm with the Guardian newspaper. We are sitting, and you've given a lecture in a country which produces oil and has produced a lot of coal in the past. Do you think oil and coal producing countries have a special obligation to help mitigate the impacts of climate change?
Can I answer now, or can I take
Please.
the 2 or 3 questions?
No.
IPCC report, including this special report, as also the IPCC previous reports, clearly indicate that whether it is 1.5 or whether it's 2.0, we live in the carbon budget world. That means that sooner or later, the use of carbon-intensive fuels will have to be curtailed. This report indicates that net zero emissions will have to occur by 2050. Now, previously, for 2-degree world, our report indicated that net zero will probably occur something close to 2070. So whether it's 2050 or 2070, it is very clear that net zero carbon emissions have to be achieved.
Thank you. In the middle at the back, please.
Andy Miles, Honorary Fellow of Scottish Environment Link. I was very interesting to hear you talk about closing the loop between human systems and natural systems. Does this indicate that the IPCC is moving towards support for the ideas of the circular economy? And is the Scottish Government correct to pursue circular economy policy rather than falling into what I see as the trap of the route of natural capital.
This special report on 1.5 presented 4 illustrative pathways, what we call a P1 through P4. And this illustrative pathways considers 4 hypothetical emissions pathways, expecting a variety of elements that may occur in the rest of the century. High demand, low demand, and then in between, considering the parameters like a strength of governance and also the likely patterns of economics and socio-economic development. If you look at, for instance, the P1 scenario presented in the figure 3.2 in our SPM, that pathway clearly indicates the assumptions of the circular economy. So yes, circular economy is one of the pathways that we assessed in the production of a special report 1.5.
Thank you. A question down here at the front, third row back. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Simon Shackley from the University of Edinburgh. I'm interested in your view about what is the role of values in this ongoing discussion, because IPCC has been very effective at reviewing science, the natural sciences, and to some extent economics. Moving into the social sciences and humanities, values are very important. And how do you see the challenge going forwards of trying to work with contending values which aren't just based upon objective reflection on scientific knowledge?
That is a very tough question. I must admit that. And what we have found, not only from this special report, but also from the findings of the 5th assessment report, we recognize that reducing the information gap will not necessarily lead to more action, for instance, like climate change. And the calculating risk is different from the perceiving the risk and also reacting to the risk. We notice that a lot of actions depend upon the value system, depend upon the social norms. Considering all these scientific informations that are provided by IPCC or other scientific organizations. Now, your question is about how the scientists associated with IPCC activities can address this question of value. I do not have the answer, because this is a matter more than the clear scientific assessment. However, we do understand that the addressing climate change issues involve a very clear understanding about the issues related to the justice and equity. And that deals with a core element of the value systems a individual has or a society have. And we continue to get scientific contributions from a various segment of the social sciences, including the philosophers and other scientific disciplines analyzing the human behavior.
Question just behind, thank you.
My name is Dr. James Irvin. I'm presently a farmer in the southern uplands of Perthshire, but my experience has been as a physician, as a researcher, as a publisher, as an editor of international journals. That leads me to some worries about what the IPCC is presenting. One, the analysis of what the scientists say. Some years ago, it was just added up who's for, who's against, a sort of consensus, which didn't go down very well. you have improved a great deal on that, as I understand it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That this is now cut down to analyzing certain papers by a whole range of panel of experts. I can tell you, as an editor of an international journal, that is an extremely difficult thing to do accurately. It is also liable to all sorts of bias, if I might say so, because what research is done is very much dependent on funding, and funding can be very, very influential, either through governments or through billionaires with missions or whoever. So there is a potential for inherent bias in that. But
So your question?
Well, I really doubt the statement that the science is as secure as I'm told. When we go on to the next point, which is in fact the estimates that's going on in economics, well, we are painfully aware of the problems that forecasting models in economics have not always been successful, quite contrary. And then lastly, if I may say, because on the ventures that I did and took on an interest in land management and had the opportunity to purchase 500 acres of southern uplands of Perthshire, and that was an extremely difficult learning curve. And I doubt if the members of the IPCC have really been up that curve on actual practical, pragmatic land management.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there,
Well,
so we're generous with the other members of the audience who want to ask a question. But if I might paraphrase, how do the IPCC working groups avoid bias and look at the vast array? I know you look at some 6,000 publications or whatever to produce such a report. How do you feel that you avoid bias?
When we have a good working group co-chair, we'll be able to avoid that bias situation. Well, IPCC is very keen on producing the objective, balanced, and comprehensive reports. And we do have a very elaborate review system. In fact, we do have 3 layers of review process. When we produce a first draft, that draft is up for an expert review. And that draft is uploaded on our website, and any experts working in institutes or universities or whatever organization present themselves with some credentials can enter into that website and receive draft and provide comments. Now, those comments have to be answered by lead authors. Every comment has to be answered by lead authors, either accept the comments or reject, and then has to provide the reason for that rejection. And then the second order draft is made. We put those draft for expert and government review, and the final draft for the government reviews. And as I said before, for this special report, there were 40,000 comments, and lead authors answered every those comments, either accept or reject, and provide reasons for the rejection. The purpose of this elaborate system of review is to avoid any bias and to uphold the integrity of the scientific assessment process. And when the cycle of IPCC are completed, the comments and the responses to the comments would be made public. So we do put great deal of emphasis and importance to this review process to avoid any appearance of bias in our assessment.
Thank you. And just keep going back on the same side. This side is not active in questions, but sorry.
My name is John Francis. I'm an advisor to UNESCO. And my question is on the availability of fresh water at a global level. Does your latest impact assessment point to a risk in the availability of the global freshwater resource?
We did find that there's a clear difference in the water security between the warming at 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. But there are differences around the region. And specifically, I mentioned the Mediterranean region, which will be much more drier than we expected for this 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there are regional differences, but the clear indication is that the water problems will get less severe if the world will be able to achieve 1.5 rather than 2.
Okay, left-hand side, up at the back in the middle. Could you put your hand up again, please, madam? Yep, thank you.
Thank you. I believe that fracking has been resumed.
And can you tell us who you are?
Sorry, Anne Edwards. I believe fracking has resumed in Lancashire today. Do you have any message for the UK government in light of that?
Well, the IPCC consists of 195 governments, and as such, we are not addressing any policy recommendations or comments to the policies of our member governments. We do respect the sovereign decisions of our member governments. So we recognize that the fracking is a very controversial issue, not only in the UK, but many other countries. But we are not in the position of commenting on specific policies in specific countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Curtis, a Fellow of the RSE and Honorary Professor at the University of Edinburgh. I very much appreciated your talk, and if I understand correctly, the emphasis is on mitigation and prevention of at least some of the climate change in future. I wonder if you might also want to comment on the IPCC's position regarding adaptation to those aspects of climate change which we may not manage to prevent, and how we can persuade governments and institutions to prioritize adaptation.
Thank you. The difficulty dealing with adaptation is to differentiate the what we call autonomous adaptation from a planned adaptation. And very much the international assistance given to adaptation activity in the developing world requires some measure of proof that such the adaptation measures were incremental to the conventional development activities. Now that's practical. That is a practical difficulties in expanding the adaptation finance or adaptation activities throughout the world. And scientifically, the difficulty lies with the finding and identifying the limits to adaptation. And it is very critical information that we understand this limits to adaptation, but very often the scientific literature indicate that it is a combination of both natural and human elements that determine the limits to adaptation. So literature is growing very rapidly to improve understanding about the limits to adaptation.
Thank you. I'm just going to leap in and ask a question, if I may. The strength of the IPCC is that you have 195 members. and that you analyse the science and that you make projections about what will happen. And one of the issues that is raised is our addiction, I suppose, to fossil fuel. And the question asked by Anne Edwards about fracking in the UK. So we have to think about, if we decide to leave that fossil fuel in the ground, there are going to be big economic implications, because of a lot of the world economic markets are based on the value, particularly of the reserves of fossil fuel that we still have in the ground. So my question is not what the IPCC should do about that, because I don't think that's your role. But I wonder if you've thought about whose role it is, because there is no comparable organisation to IPCC who can, if you like, lead global activity in this way.
Well, the IPCC assessment, including this special report, as well as our previous assessment report, clearly indicates that the mitigation may have a side effect. That side effect includes the negative impact of mitigation on the economy, which depends on the fossil resources. So IPCC assessment recognizes this hardship, potential hardship that the fossil intensive economies may suffer in the transition to the low carbon world. I believe that this assets, fossil assets, stranded assets, will be one component of the cost of mitigation. And how to address these stranded assets will be a very important aspects for developing relevant policies pursuing the transition to the low carbon world. So we know that the literature is again growing in the understanding of these stranded assets. A couple of years ago, some literature indicate that the assets held by the corporations, publicly held energy corporations, may not suffer much from stranded assets. But the assets held by national state oil companies may suffer greatly from the transition to the low carbon world. So we do have a better understanding, beginning to have better understanding about the nature of the stranded assets, and we'll continue to study more and watch how the things will develop in the understanding of stranded assets. With regard to who will address these questions of stranded assets, well, from the IPCC perspective, we rely on the scientific communities to study and analyze these problems, and AR6 that will be handled by Professor Jim Skee will give a clear understanding, clear direction on the question of the stranded assets. We believe that is a very important component of the realization of the 1.5 degree world.
Thank you. Yep, Andy.
Andy Kerr from the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. You explained that delivering 1.5 degrees would be better for people's health and prosperity than 2 degrees. We've just come from a workshop here at the RSE looking at this transition for workforces, and clearly there are winners and losers. So one of the people at the workshop was saying, all that we have seen from climate and energy policies have been energy price rises, and we've lost our jobs because of the changing structures in the economy. What are your reflections, or have you looked at within the IPCC the winners and the losers of this transition in more detail?
Well, we know that there will be losers and winners from a policy change. That is not only limited to the climate change policy or energy policy. Any policy creates winners and losers. And therefore, as indicated in our previous assessment, as well as also this special report 1.5, the societal acceptability of policy depends greatly about how the distributional equity is perceived by the people, how the consequential, how the consequences of consequences of policy affect the stakeholders of that specific policy, and we do believe that the strength of the governance and the strength of the social capital will help to minimize the negative cost of this conflict, potential conflict between winners and losers. And we identified certain elements of enabling conditions to improve the better harmonious, producing a better harmonious outcomes, given the unavoidable situations of having winners and losers confronting with regard to a specific policy changes. A lot depends upon the culture and also legacy of individual countries, individual communities. And there's no, may I say, one-size-fits-all solution in this question. I believe you continue to work on finding the most agreeable solution workable for your community and for your country.
And question again at the right-hand side. Thank you.
My name is Alex Luchford, and I'm from the 2050 Climate Group. I'm very interested in how you're talking about your future reports will be looking at the social sciences, and I'm wondering, I have a two-part question really. I'm wondering, firstly, will you be looking at how we can bridge the gap between knowing that we need to make certain changes in our lives? For example, it's fairly well established that reducing meat and dairy consumption will reduce carbon emissions, reducing fossil fuel consumption will reduce carbon emissions. So I'm wondering if you'll be looking at kind of the social sciences and psychology side of bridging that gap between knowing that and then getting people to make those changes. And secondly, what changes you personally have made in your life to reduce your carbon impact?
Okay.
Well, I need to go back to the initial presentation. There I said that the human caused this global warming. And then I said that it will be human that will be able to solve this problem. And this special report found that the achieving 1.5 degree world will not necessarily be constrained by any elements in the natural system. It's rather by a human system. And that is the reason why we were able to say that transition will not be impossible, but it will require a great deal of changes in all aspects of society. Now, how the humans would behave in this changing circumstances, we have noticed that a great deal of changes in society happened for the last 50 years. And even though I said, and our official press release said that we should expect unprecedented transitions in our life. In fact, when we recall what has happened in our last 3 or 4 decades, those changes, I believe, really unprecedented changes. Therefore, if we are keen on changing or responding to this threat of climate change, and also at the same time recognize the opportunities that will be presented by this challenge of responding to climate change, then the changes that we expect may not be unprecedented. And that's largely due to the ingenuity of human nature. And I believe that the closing the gap between the nature and human really depends upon the humans. And that is the reason why we recognize the importance of engaging the contributions from the social sciences in addition to the contributions from the natural science. We need to work, we means social science and natural sciences need to work much more closely, much more in a collaborative fashion, especially when we need to understand this challenge of meeting 1.5 degrees from the perspective of making it happen in the real world. We need to consider how much our effort will cost in our daily lives. And that desire to understand the cost of action requires a very clear understanding about the cost of damage that will be potentially caused by the climate change. And understanding of damage requires a deep collaboration between the natural science as well as between economic science. And I believe that the closing the gap between the human side and the natural side is the way we should pursue to have full picture of the climate change issues and also the solution aspect of the climate change issues.
And do you want to tell us if you've made any changes?
From my perspective, when I do something, I do not really know whether I have changed or not. And but I do not want to say what I have done consciously in terms of the improving climate change problems. I do have several practices in my daily life, but I do not want to say anything public about my private daily life.
I understand that.
But I contribute. I believe I contribute to the lessening of the climate problems in my own way.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question, right at the back in the middle.
Thank you. John Gillis, I'm RSE Fellow and Honorary Professor at the University of Edinburgh and a physician. I worked for some time in developing countries, Dr. Lee, and have continuing links there. And you mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa in your talk, and also the values of justice and equity in the work of IPCC. And my question was, do you think that there is sufficient prominence in the current work of the IPCC on 1.5 and in your future reports on the effects of climate change on people in Sub-Saharan Africa who are the most economically disadvantaged in the world?
The regional evaluation assessments of climate change impacts are one of the critical elements of the IPCC assessments. And this regional information was highly configured, starting from the third assessment report. And then in the fifth assessment report, we produced a separate volume addressing specifically about the climate change in the regional aspects. We do in fact produce that volume analyzing various the impacts occurring in various parts of the world. So this regional understanding, improving the understanding of regional climate change is not only important for developing countries, but also for every country in the world. With regard to the developing world, there's a challenge that we found a somewhat large gap in research materials, literatures regarding the climate change impacts in developing world. And we need to improve the availability of research addressing the climate change impacts and other matters in the developing world. And we understand what has caused that gap in the literature in the specific issues. In a small way, that could be possible in contributing to narrowing down the research gap. The IPCC has operated a scholarship program, and the seed of the scholarship fund was the prize money given by the Nobel Committee when the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And the IPCC decided to use that money as the seed money for the IPCC scholarship fund. We help graduate students and early phase scientists in the least developing countries to pursue their scientific research career. So in a small way, although IPCC mandate does not have anything about the capacity building, we do have programs to support the capacity building in the scientific community, scientific endeavor in developing countries. We do hope that other organizations provide better support for the scientists in the developing world. In that way, IPCC assessments can reflect much more balanced analysis of the climate change issues throughout and around the world.
Thank you. We have no more time for questions, so I'd like to ask Dr. Lee to stay seated here whilst I invite Mr. Ivan McKee, Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation, to give a vote of thanks. Minister, please.
Thank you, and I would like to begin by offering my thanks to Dr. Lee for an extremely fascinating and timely lecture. Thank you. I would also like to thank Professor Glover and the Royal Society of Edinburgh for inviting me here to give these closing remarks, and I'll use them to reflect on Dr. Lee's themes of tackling climate change and delivering sustainable economic growth mean for Scotland. Good science underpins good policy making, and the work of Dr. Lee and the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in synthesising climate science underpins the global policy response. The new report on the evidence for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees represents a key advance. Scotland was one of the first countries to respond to the Paris Agreement with proposals for strengthening legally binding emissions reductions targets. The bill we introduced at Parliament in May proposes targets as advised by the UK Committee on Climate Change. The bill will give Scotland the most ambitious statutory targets of any country in the world for 2020, 2030 and 2040, and will mean Scotland is carbon neutral by 2050. It would be easy also to set a net zero target for all greenhouse gases now without knowing how that could be achieved. Our target for Scotland is backed by a stretching and credible package of on-the-ground delivery measures to reduce emissions immediately. This approach is working. Emissions are already down by almost half since 1990. The IPCC's new report makes it very clear that all countries must now urgently assess what more can be done. Even those of us leading the charge cannot rest on our laurels. That is why we have today joined with the UK Government in requesting advice from the CCC on what the IPCC report means for our targets. If the CCC now consider that Scotland can set even more ambitious targets in light of the IPCC report or their consideration of increased actions across the UK, then we'll act on that advice. Tackling huge and complex problems like climate change requires positivity and optimism, and that's why, as Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation, I am focused on the economic benefits the low-carbon transition will have in Scotland. What the Office for National Statistics calls the Scottish low-carbon and renewable energy economy already supports 49,000 jobs and generates £11 billion in turnover. Scotland's place at the forefront of the global transition means that the economic opportunities will continue to increase and spread across all parts of the economy. The International Finance Corporation estimates that the Paris Agreement will help open up $23 trillion worth of opportunities between now and 2030. The unprecedented pace of technological change means that what is possible in all of our industries and occupations is changing, and indeed new ones are being created. This is an exciting time. I am, however, mindful that the pace of change also poses challenges. A lot of what we need to do to decarbonise has very real impacts on people's jobs and communities. The closure of Scotland's last coal-fired power station at Longannet in 2016 significantly reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, but with associated impact on jobs. That is why the Scottish Government is establishing a Just Transition Commission to provide expert advice on adjusting to a low-carbon economy in a fair way. We are taking the international concept of just transition and exploring with stakeholders how to apply this in Scotland. A key principle of just transition is that no one gets left behind as the employment landscape shifts. The Commission will explore this and advise on continuing the transition in a way that promotes cohesion and equality. We have recently announced Professor Jim Skee, who is here today as Chair of the Commission, and we look forward to receiving his advice. In summary, our direction of travel is clear. The Scottish Government is firmly committed to achieving net zero emissions of all our greenhouse gases as soon as possible and invite other countries, including the UK, to join us in this. The way in which we reach that goal is vital. Credible targets based on the best evidence and advice will allow us to deliver economic growth and adjust to the low-carbon economy in a fair way whilst meeting our climate obligations. I've been very pleased to hear Dr. Lee's view from the IPCC on economic development and climate change this evening. Thank you again, and I now invite Professor Glover to provide closing remarks. Thank you.
Minister, many thanks for that, which sums up what an outstanding lecture we've had from Dr. Lee, and also how governments aim to respond to the evidence put forward by IPCC in their reports. And I hope it's made us all think a bit more carefully about the planet that hosts us and our role in looking after it. If you've enjoyed this evening's event and you like being engaged and provoked and providing your views, then please have a look at the RSE website for details about our public engagement programme. You'll also be sent a short email questionnaire after this lecture, and I'd be very pleased indeed if you would feed your thoughts back to us. The RSE is Scotland's national academy, and it is for everyone in Scotland. So we're very keen to hear your views, and you will always be made very welcome here. Finally, can I ask you to remain seated while those in the front row and those going to the Scott room after this lecture can leave the lecture theatre. But the last word is thank you to Dr. Lee, thank you to the Minister, thank you to all of you for attending and contributing to this lecture, and have a safe journey home. Thank you.